Welcome to the deep dive. So try and picture this. Medieval India. It's this landscape just absolutely buzzing with spiritual energy. You've got temples, monasteries everywhere, and this huge wave of really personal devotion sweeping across the land.
And to really get a handle on that time, you can't just look at the big formal institutions, can you? You have to dig deeper into what people were actually doing, feeling, believing on the ground.
Exactly, and that's what this deep dive is all about. We're plunging into the world of the Bhakti and Sufi traditions. These really flourished, didn't they, across the Indian subcontinent, say roughly between the 8th and 18th century?
That's the time frame, yeah.
Yeah.
A period of just incredible spiritual creativity and change.
And we've got some fascinating sources to work with, bits from historical texts, some analysis of, religious buildings, and what I find really exciting, the devotional poetry and the life stories of these amazing saints who were central figures.
Definitely. Our mission here, for you listening, is really to cut through the layers and pull out the key insights. We want you to get a real sense of the dynamism, the sheer variety of beliefs and practices, how different traditions sometimes bumped up against each other, sometimes blended.
Integrated, yeah. And also where there was friction, conflict, because it wasn't all smooth sailing.
Not at all. The idea is this deep dive gives you a kind of shortcut to being genuinely well-informed about this complex but incredibly vibrant period.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Where do we start? If we go back to maybe the middle of the first millennium CE, what did the religious scene look like then?
Well, it certainly wasn't empty. The landscape was already marked by religious structures. You'd find Buddhist stupas, monasteries, early Hindu temples, and historians piece together the beliefs and practices of that time, partly from texts being compiled then, like the Puranas.
Right, and then moving into the period we're focusing on, you get this explosion of different kinds of source material.
Exactly. You see the emergence of compositions by these figures we call poet saints. And the interesting thing is, these weren't always written down straight away. Often, they were oral traditions.
Sung right, in local languages that people actually spoke. Tamil, Kannada, later on Hindi, Punjabi.
Precisely. Languages accessible to everyone. And it was often up to their disciples, sometimes generations later, to gather these compositions, write them down, preserve them.
Which, thinking like a historian, must create some challenges if they started oral and were written down later.
Oh, absolutely. Because they weren't fixed texts set in stone from day one. They were living, breathing traditions. They evolved. Over time, followers might add things, elaborate on the original words, maybe even change or drop bits that didn't quite fit their later understanding.
So you have to approach them knowing they have this history of transmission, this fluidity.
You do. They're incredibly rich sources, but you need that awareness. And alongside the poetry, historians rely a lot on hagiographies.
Biographies of the saints, written with followers.
Right. Now, these aren't like modern fact-checked biographies. They're often full of miracles, legends, extraordinary events, but their value isn't necessarily about literal historical accuracy point by point.
It's more about how the followers saw the saint, what they valued.
Exactly that. They show us how these figures were perceived, what qualities were revered, what stories circulated about their spiritual power, their closeness to the divine. They're a window into the devotion itself.
Okay. Now, the sources mention a concept to help think about how all these different layers interacted the idea of great and little traditions. Though it comes from much later, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Coined by sociologist Robert Redfield in the 20th century. He was looking at peasant societies and noticed their culture seemed to draw from two streams.
The great tradition being
Practices linked to dominant groups, priests, rulers, scholars, often associated with formal scriptures, big institutions, maybe classical languages like Sanskrit.
And the little tradition.
More the local stuff. Village-level beliefs, regional customs, often oral, passed down locally.
But Redfield's key point was they weren't separate worlds. They interacted.
Constantly. Influencing each other, borrowing from each other, changing each other over time. Now, here's where it gets interesting for historians studying our period.
The terms themselves. Great and little.
Yeah. Well, the idea interaction between, say, Sanskritic traditions and local practices is really useful. Many scholars feel uncomfortable with the words great and little because they imply a hierarchy, like one is inherently superior.
Right. Which is why you often see them in quotation marks in academic writing.
Exactly. It's a way of using the framework to talk about the process of interaction and exchange without endorsing the idea that one tradition is better or more important than the other. Understanding how these different strands influenced each other without imposing our own value judgments is really key.
So let's apply that framework back to the 8th to 18th centuries. What did this religious landscape, this interaction, actually look like?
Well, it was incredibly diverse, a real mosaic. One really striking thing is just the sheer visibility of a huge range of gods and goddesses in sculpture, in texts. The major players, Vishnu, Shiva, the goddess, in her many forms, were definitely central. But the ways they were depicted and worshipped just proliferated.
And historians see a couple of main processes at work here, driving this evolution.
They do. One process was the effort to spread Brahmanical ideas more widely. Think about the Puranic texts. They were often composed in simpler Sanskrit verse.
Making them more accessible than the older Vedic texts.
Exactly. Accessible to groups like women and Shudras, who were traditionally barred from Vedic learning. So it was a kind of popularization, a dissemination downwards.
And the other process
Was the reverse flow. It was Brahmanas themselves, absorbing, adapting, and kind of reworking the beliefs and practices that came from other social groups, from local traditions, integrating them into their own framework.
So it's like a continuous conversation happening all over the place.
That's a great way to put it. A continuous dialogue between these great Sanskritic Puranic traditions and the innumerable little local traditions scattered across the land.
Can you give us an example of that dialogue in action?
Well, a fantastic example is the deity Jagannatha at Puri in modern-day Odisha. The source mentions figure 6.2. Here you had a local deity whose image was actually made of wood and by tribal specialists.
Okay, so clearly rooted in a local, perhaps non-Sanskritic tradition.
Right. But by the 12th century, this deity comes to be identified as a form of Vishnu within the broader Vaishnava framework. He's given the name Jagannatha, Lord of the World.
But did the image change to look like standard Vishnu images?
That's the fascinating part. No, the source explicitly says his visualization remained very different from how Vishnu was depicted elsewhere. So the local form, the wooden image made by tribal specialists, was retained even as the deity was integrated into the pan-Indian Puranic system. It's integration, but not erasure of the local.
That's a powerful example. Does this happen with goddesses too?
Absolutely. You had widespread worship of local goddesses, sometimes represented very simply, maybe just a stone smeared with ochre. These local figures were often brought into the Puranic fold by identifying them as wives or consorts of the major male gods.
So a local goddess might become identified as Lakshmi, wife of Vishnu, or Parvati, wife of Shiva?
Precisely. It's like giving them a place within the established divine family tree, integrating local power into the broader structure.
And then there are the tantric practices mentioned. What role did they play?
Tantra was another significant strand, widespread, often associated with the goddess worship. And interestingly, tantric practices were frequently open to both women and men.
And less concerned with caste.
Often, yes. Within the context of tantric ritual, caste and class distinctions were sometimes deliberately ignored or overridden. These ideas and practices influenced both Shaivism and Buddhism, particularly in eastern, northern, and southern parts of India. Figure 6.3 shows a Buddhist goddess, Marichi, reflecting this interaction.
It's quite something to think that all these diverse threads, Puranic developments, local deities being integrated, tantric practices would eventually, much later, get grouped together under that single umbrella term, Hindu.
It is, and it wasn't always a smooth blending either. There were definite differences, even conflicts.
Like between Vedic and Puranic traditions.
Yes. If you compare them, key Vedic gods like Agni, Indra, Soma become much less prominent in the Puranas. And while Vishnu, Shiva, and the goddess appear in the Vedas, their Puranic forms, stories, and modes of worship are vastly different, much more elaborate.
Yet the Vedas still held authority.
They continued to be revered as foundational authoritative texts, even as popular practice shifted significantly towards these Puranic deities and forms.
Did that create tension?
It could. You had some followers of the Vedic tradition emphasizing sacrifice and mantras who might condemn practices outside that, like Tantra. Conversely, tantric practitioners might ignore Vedic authority.
And what about devotees of Vishnu versus Shiva?
Well, yes. Devotees often proclaim their chosen deity, Vishnu or Shiva, as the supreme being, which could lead to rivalry and tension between Vaishnava and Shaiva groups. Plus, there were interactions, sometimes competitive or conflicting, with other established traditions like Buddhism and Jainism.
So it's a really dynamic, sometimes contentious environment.
Absolutely. And it's right within this dynamic mix of integration and conflict that we need to place the rise and spread of these powerful traditions of devotion, or bhakti.
Bhakti wasn't entirely new to this period, though.
No, devotional worship certainly had a long history before the 8th century, but during this era, it took on new forms, new intensity. It ranged from, more routine temple worship to these incredibly ecstatic states, often fueled by passionate singing and chanting, especially within Vaishnava and Shaiva circles.
And the poet saints were central to this explosion of devotionalism.
They really were. They became these charismatic figures, leaders around whom communities of devoted followers gathered and grew.
And a key feature seems to be their inclusivity.
Very much so. While Brahmanas still played roles as intermediaries in some bhakti contexts, many of these new movements explicitly welcomed people traditionally excluded from paths to liberation in stricter Brahmanical frameworks. Women, people from lower castes.
And there wasn't just one kind of bhakti, was there?
Not at all. Huge diversity. But historians often find it useful to think in terms of two broad categories, saguna and nirguna.
Saguna being devotion to God with form, with attributes.
Right. Worshipping specific deities like Shiva or Vishnu and his avatars, or the goddess in her various manifestations, often visualized in human-like or anthropomorphic forms.
And nirguna.
Is devotion to God without form, without attributes, an abstract ultimate reality beyond specific visualization.
Okay, so where do we see the earliest major bhakti movements taking shape?
The Tamil region, down south, starting around the 6th century CE, is where we see some of the most influential early movements. The Alvars and the Nayanars.
The Alvars were devoted to Vishnu, the Nayanars to Shiva.
Correct. And these poet-saints traveled widely, singing hymns in Tamil, the local language. Figure 6.1 shows a sculpture of Manikavachakar, a Nayanar saint, giving us a sense of these revered figures.
And their travels and songs had a real impact on the landscape.
Definitely. As they traveled, they identified specific shrines as being particularly sacred, the dwelling places of their chosen deity. This led to these sites growing into major temple complexes and important centers of pilgrimage. The hymns themselves became part of the temple rituals.
And even images of the saints were worshipped.
Yes, which is quite remarkable. The saints themselves became objects of devotion alongside the deities.
Now, there's this idea that the Alvars and Nayanars were challenging the social order, particularly the caste system and the dominance of Brahmanas. Is there evidence for that?
There certainly is. If you look at who these bhaktas, these devotees actually were, they came from a really wide range of social backgrounds. You find Brahmanas, yes, but also artisans, cultivators, even people from groups considered untouchable. This social diversity itself was a departure from more rigid structures.
And they made bold claims about their own compositions.
They did. They asserted that their hymns in Tamil were as sacred, as authoritative as the Sanskrit Vedas revered by the Brahmanas. The great collection of Alvar hymns, the Nalayira Divyaprabandham, mentioned in Source 1, was actually called the Tamil Veda. That's a direct claim to equal status.
Let's look at the specific examples. Source 2 is from Tandar Dipudi, an Alvar who was himself a Brahmana. What's his argument?
He basically says that Vishnu prefers devotees who show genuine love, even if they come from outcast backgrounds, over Brahmanas who might know all 4 Vedas, Chaturvedins, but lack that heartfelt devotion.
That's quite a statement from a Brahmana, prioritizing devotion over birth and scriptural knowledge.
Absolutely. Now, compare that with Source 3 from Apario, a Nayanar saint.
Yeah.
He's addressing people seeking Shiva.
And he tells them not to worry about things like law books, lineage, gotra, or family kula.
Right. He says, just bow down to Shiva as your refuge. He's essentially dismissing the importance of the very thing's lineage, adherence to legal codes that often define status in the Brahmanical system.
So, while they come from slightly different angles, both Tandara-Adipati and Apar seem to be elevating personal devotion above social status and ritual expertise defined by birth or formal learning.
That's the core message, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're opening the door, saying the path to God is through love and surrender, accessible to anyone, regardless of their social position or knowledge of complex texts.
Another striking feature is the visibility of women devotees.
Truly remarkable. You have figures like Andal, a woman Alvar, whose intensely personal poems expressing her love for Vishnu are still incredibly popular. And then Karakal Amayar, a Nayanar devotee of Shiva, shown in Figure 6.4.
She chose a path of extreme asceticism, right?
She did. She renounced conventional life, wandered, and composed powerful poetry that was preserved within the Nayanar tradition.
These women were challenging norms just by existing and pursuing devotion in this way.
Absolutely. They stepped outside the expected roles of wife and mother. They didn't necessarily join formal monastic orders, but forged their own paths. Their very presence and the power of their poetic voices inherently challenged patriarchal expectations about women's roles and spiritual capabilities.
Let's look at source 4, Caracalla Meyer's poem, where she describes herself as a peri, a kind of demoness. She lists things like bulging veins, protruding eyes, shrunken stomach, red hair. How does this contrast with typical ideas of female beauty?
It's a complete inversion. It's almost grotesque. She's deliberately rejecting every conventional marker of feminine beauty and desirability. She's embracing an emaciated, wild, even terrifying form.
Why do that? What's the effect?
It seems to be a radical statement about her devotion. By stripping away all concern for conventional appearance and social norms, she's embodying a fierce, untamed commitment solely to Shiva, who himself is often associated with cremation grounds and ascetic practices. It's a powerful symbol of renunciation and transformation through devotion, embracing a form utterly detached from worldly concerns.
Shifting focus slightly, what was the political situation in the Tamil region at this time?
You had major dynasties ruling the Pallavas, the Pandyas, and later the very powerful Cholas. And it's worth remembering that Buddhism and Jainism were also significant traditions there, and they sometimes received royal support too.
But the Bhakti hymns often show hostility towards Buddhism and Jainism.
Yes, particularly the Nayanar hymns. Historians often interpret this as evidence of competition. Competition for followers, yes, but crucially, also competition for royal patronage, which brought land grants, resources, and prestige.
And the Chola rulers from the 9th to 13th centuries, they really threw their weight behind Brahmanical and Bhakti tradition.
Oh, absolutely. They were major patrons. They granted land, built magnificent temples for Vishnu and Shiva. Think of the incredible temples at Chidambaram, Thanjavur, Gangakondapuram. These were huge state-sponsored projects.
And art from this period, like the Nataraja bronzes, figure 6.5, was directly inspired by the Bhakti saints' visions.
Very much so. The artistic production was often deeply intertwined with the devotional themes and imagery found in the hymns.
Why were the rulers, especially the Cholas, so interested in supporting these movements?
Well, the Alvars and Nayanars had a huge popular following, especially among important agricultural groups like the Valala peasants. Rulers needed the support, or at least the acquiescence, of these groups.
So, by patronizing the saints and their traditions, the kings were aligning themselves with popular sentiment.
Exactly. Building grand temples, decorating them with sculptures depicting the saints' visions, it was a way for the Chola kings to claim divine backing for their own rule, project their power, and connect with their subjects on a spiritual level.
They even promoted the singing of the hymns in temples and collected them.
Yes, they actively integrated the Tamil Shaiva hymns into royal temple rituals. And they took the initiative to have these hymns collected and organized, like the compilation known as the Tevaram. We even have inscriptions, like one from 945 CE, mentioning King Parantaka commissioning metal images of Nayanar saints to be carried in processions.
So that connection between the rulers and the bhaktas seems like a mutually beneficial arrangement in a way.
It does seem that way. The rulers gained legitimacy and popular support, while the Bhakti traditions received resources, protection, and wider prominence. It's a dynamic we see playing out in different ways across the subcontinent.
Okay, let's move northwards in geography and slightly later in time to Karnataka in the 12th century. This is where the Virashaiva tradition emerges.
That's right. A very significant movement led by a figure named Basavanna. He was actually a Brahmana and served as a minister in the court of a Kalachuri king.
His followers are known as Virashaivas or Lingayats.
Yes, Lingayats, meaning wearers of the linga, is the more common term today. They are still a very important community in Karnataka.
And their core practice is worshipping Shiva in the form of a linga.
Precisely. Men usually wear a small linga in a silver case, often hung from a thread over the shoulder, and they have a distinct belief about the afterlife.
They reject rebirth.
Yes. They believe that upon death, the devotee unites directly with Shiva and does not return to the cycle of rebirth. This is a major departure from mainstream Hindu thought.
And this affects their funeral practices.
It does. Instead of cremation, which is prescribed in the Dharmashastras, Lingayats ceremonially bury their dead, reflecting their belief in final union rather than transition to another life.
And they challenge the social order quite directly.
Very much so. They strongly challenged the caste system and the whole idea of ritual pollution attributed to certain groups by Brahmanas. Questioning rebirth also struck at a fundamental tenet.
Which must have made the movement appealing to those marginalized by the caste system.
Absolutely. It offered an alternative spiritual path and social identity that rejected those hierarchies. They also actively encouraged social practices disapproved of in the Dharmashastras, like post-puberty marriage and significantly the remarriage of widows.
How do we know about their beliefs and practices?
Primarily through vachanas, which means sayings. These are poems or prose poems composed in the Kannada language by people within the movement, both men and women.
We have an example from Basavanna himself in Source 4 from the PDF. It's the one comparing stone snakes and real snakes, and images versus real people.
Right. When they see a serpent carved in stone, they pour milk on it. If a real serpent comes, they say, "Kill, kill." And to the servant of the god who could eat if served, they say, "Go away, go away." But to the image of the god which cannot eat, they offer dishes of food.
It's such a sharp critique. What's his core message there?
He's hitting hard at hypocrisy and misplaced priorities in religious practice. He contrasts the reverence shown to inanimate symbols, the stone snake, the idol, with the neglect or hostility shown towards living beings, the real snake, the hungry devotee.
He's highlighting the absurdity.
Exactly. The absurdity and the ethical failure. Pouring milk on stone while killing a living creature. Offering food to an image that can't eat while turning away someone who can. He's trying to shock his audience into seeing the emptiness of ritual performed without genuine compassion and engagement with the real world. He wants a more authentic, ethical devotion.
So while all this intense devotional activity is happening in the South, what's going on in North India during the same broad time frame?
Well, you certainly had ongoing worship of Vishnu and Shiva in temples, often with royal support, similar to the South. But what's different, according to historians, is the apparent lack of large-scale poet-saint movements producing compositions like the Alvars and Nayanars, at least until later, around the 14th century.
Why might that be?
Yeah.
Any theories?
One factor might be the political landscape. In North India, you had the rise of numerous Rajput states. In many of these kingdoms, Brahmanas seem to have held very strong positions, both in administration and as ritual authorities. Perhaps there was less space or opportunity early on for widespread popular movements challenging that authority compared to the South.
But there were other religious leaders operating outside that orthodox Brahmanical framework.
Oh, definitely. Groups like the Naths, Yogis, and Siddhas were influential. Figure 6.7 shows Emperor Jahangir meeting with a yogi, indicating their presence even at elite levels. Many of these figures came from artisan communities like weavers.
And those communities were becoming more important economically.
Yes, with the growth of craft production, trade routes, especially connecting towards Central Asia, and the development of urban centers.
Did these leaders challenge the establishment?
They often did. They questioned the authority of the Vedas. They used local languages to communicate their ideas, reaching ordinary people. But despite their popularity, they don't seem to have attracted the same level of large-scale, sustained support from the ruling elites as the Southern Bhakti movements did, at least not initially.
And then things changed dramatically with the arrival of the Turks.
That was a major turning point. The establishment of the Delhi Sultanate in the 17th century significantly altered the political map. It undermined many of the existing Rajput states and, consequently, the position of the Brahmanas associated with them. This ushered in really marked changes in culture and religion.
And crucially, this period saw the arrival and spread of Sufism in the subcontinent.
Exactly. The coming of the Sufis was a hugely significant part of this transformation.
So let's turn to the Islamic traditions. India had contact with the Islamic world for a long time before the Sultanate, right?
Oh, for centuries. Arab merchants were active on the western coast. There were interactions with Central Asians in the northwest. These regions became part of what we call the Islamic world from the 7th century onwards.
But the establishment of Muslim ruling dynasties was a new phase.
Yes. Starting with Muhammad Qasim in Sind in 711, then the Delhi Sultanate founded by Turks and Afghans in the 13th century, later sultanates in the Deccan and elsewhere, the Mughal Empire from the 16th century, and even regional states later on. For centuries, Islam was the religion of the rulers in many parts of the subcontinent.
And theoretically, these rulers were supposed to be guided by the ulama, the Islamic scholars, and govern according to Sharia Islamic law.
That was the ideal, yes. The Sharia, based on the Quran, the Prophet's traditions, hadiths, and scholarly methods like reasoning, qiyas, and consensus ijma.
But the reality in India was complicated by the fact that most of the population wasn't Muslim.
Precisely. This led to adaptations. The category of zimmi, or protected people, originally applied to Jews and Christians under Muslim rule, was extended to Hindus in India.
They paid a tax, the jizya, for protection.
Correct. And the source notes that later rulers, especially the Mughals, increasingly saw themselves as rulers of all their subjects, regardless of faith.
So, did rulers tend to enforce Islamic law strictly on everyone?
In practice, they often adopted much more flexible policies. They granted land and tax exemptions not just to Muslim institutions, but also to Hindu, Jaina, Zoroastrian, Christian, and Jewish religious establishments.
And they sometimes showed respect to non-Muslim religious figures.
Yes, definitely. We saw that painting of Jahangir with the Jogi, figure 6.7.
Yeah.
The Jogi would likely worship Shiva or a related deity. The emperor's engagement shows respect and interest.
The sources give examples from the Mughals. Source 5 is Akbar's order from 1598 about building a church in Kambat. He tells his officials not to interfere.
What does that explicit instruction suggest? Who might Akbar have expected opposition from?
Well, it suggests he knew that building a Christian church might face resistance, perhaps from more conservative Muslim groups, or maybe just local officials who were reluctant to support a non-Muslim project. By issuing a direct order not to obstruct, Akbar is clearly stating his policy of tolerance and protection for this minority religious community, overriding any potential local objections.
And source 6 shows Aurangzeb, often seen as more orthodox, writing respectfully to a Jogi, Shiv Murad, in 1661-62, sending offerings and calling him the possessor of the sublime station.
So the relationship between rulers and different religious communities seems quite nuanced, even complex.
Very much so. It wasn't monolithic. Policies varied, and rulers had pragmatic reasons, as well as perhaps personal inclinations, to engage with diverse religious groups.
Okay, moving beyond the rulers, how did Islam take root and spread among the wider population, peasants, artisans, merchants?
Well, those who converted to Islam adopted the core tenets: the belief in one God and Prophet Muhammad, Shahada, the 5 daily prayers, namaz salat, charity, zakat, fasting during Ramzan Tom, and the pilgrimage to Mecca, Hajj. These became universal features.
But these universal practices were then layered onto existing local cultures.
Exactly. You had sectarian differences like Sunni and Shia, and crucially, the way Islam was practiced was often deeply influenced by the local customs, languages, and existing traditions of the converts.
Like the Khojas you mentioned earlier, an Ismaili Shia group.
Yes, they developed really innovative ways to communicate Quranic ideas using local literary forms. They composed Jainan devotional poems, the name coming from the Sanskrit jnana knowledge, in languages like Punjabi, Multani, Sindhi. These were sung communally. Figure 6.8 even shows their unique Khojaki script, derived from local scripts.
That's a fascinating blend, and the example of Arab traders on the Malabar coast.
Also striking. They settled there, adopted Malayalam, the local language, and even integrated local social customs, like matrilineal, tracing descent through the mother, and matrilineal residence, husband moving to wife's home. It shows Islam becoming part of the existing social fabric.
You can even see this blending in mosque architecture.
Absolutely. Mosques everywhere have universal features like the mihrab pointing towards Mecca and the minbar or pulpit. But beyond that, the styles vary enormously depending on local traditions and materials.
The figures show this clearly. The Kerala Mosque, with a roof like a temple spire, Shikara, the brick mosque in Bangladesh, the wooden mosque in Kashmir, with its distinctive spire and carving.
It's a visual reminder that a universal faith found expression through diverse, localized cultural forms. It makes you think about local mosques you might see and notice these kinds of blends.
And it's important to remember that the labels Hindu and Muslim weren't fixed categories for much of this period.
Not in the way we use them today, as clearly defined, separate religious communities. People were often identified by their origin: Turushka for Turks, Tajika for Tajiks, Parashika for Persians.
Sometimes older terms for foreigners were used for newer groups.
Yes, terms like Shakas or Yavanas were sometimes applied to Turks and Afghans. And the term Lecha was often used for migrant groups who didn't follow caste rules or speak Sanskrit-based languages.
Yeah.
It could be derogatory, but it didn't usually mean a specific Muslim identity opposed to a Hindu one.
And Hindu itself had various meanings, not always strictly religious.
Right. Identities were often more fluid, based on region, language, social custom, rather than a hard religious boundary for a long time.
Okay, this brings us neatly to the development of Sufism. Where did it start?
Sufism emerged in the early centuries of Islam among individuals drawn to asceticism, mysticism, and intense personal devotion to God. It rose partly as a reaction against what some saw as the growing worldliness and materialism of the caliphate.
And they had a different approach to scripture than the theologians.
Often, yes. They sometimes critiqued what they saw as overly dogmatic or legalistic interpretations of the Quran and the Prophet's traditions, Sunnah. Their focus was on seeking salvation through intense love, ishq, and devotion, following God's commands and emulating the Prophet Muhammad, whom they saw as the perfect human being. They valued personal experiential understanding gained through their spiritual journey.
The term Sufism itself is relatively late, isn't it?
Yes, it's an English term for the 19th century. The term in Islamic texts is tasawwuf. Scholars debate its origins maybe from suf, wool, referring to simple garments, safa, purity, or sufa, a platform near the Prophet's mosque.
How did Sufism become more organized?
From around the 11th century, it started developing more defined structures. You get Sufi literature, and the key institution becomes the khanqah, or hospice. This was the center run by a spiritual master, a sheikh, pir, or murshid.
The master guided disciples, murids.
Exactly. Enrolled them, guided their spiritual practice, appointed a successor, khalifa, to continue the lineage, and set rules for life in the khanqah.
And this led to the formation of silsilas.
Yes. Around the 12th century, these silsilas, or chains, crystallized. A silsila signifies this continuous spiritual lineage, linking the current master back through previous masters, all the way to the Prophet Muhammad. This chain was believed to transmit spiritual power or blessing, barakat.
Initiation involved specific rituals.
Often, yes. Oaths of allegiance, perhaps receiving a patched cloak, ritual shaving of the head. And the silsilas got names, often from the founder, like Qadiri, or the place they originated, like Chishti from Chisht in Afghanistan.
What happened when a sheikh died?
Their tomb, or dargah, became a major center for devotion. Pilgrimage to the dargah, called ziyarat, became incredibly important, especially on the anniversary of the saint's death, the Urs.
Urs means marriage, right? Symbolizing the soul's union with God.
Precisely. The belief grew that the saint, now united with God, could intercede for devotees, granting blessings for both worldly problems and spiritual progress. This fostered the cult of the saint, revered as a wali, friend of God, believed to possess divine favor and the ability to perform miracles, karamat.
The tomb of Data Ganj Bakhsh in Lahore is a key example.
A very famous one. Abul Hassan al-Huviri settled there in the 11th century, wrote an influential text on Sufism, and his tomb became a huge pilgrimage site, the Data Darbar, Court of the Giver.
Now, not all Sufis lived in khanqahs.
No. You had groups who deliberately rejected the settled life of the khanqah. They often lived as wandering mendicants, practiced celibacy, ignored many formal rituals, and sometimes pursued extreme forms of asceticism.
Groups like the Qalandars, Madaris, Malangs.
Yes, they were often termed bi-Sharia, meaning outside or defiant of the Sharia, in contrast to the ba-Sharia Sufis who lived within the khanqahs and generally complied with Islamic law.
Of all the Sufi orders that came to India, the Chishtis became the most influential. Why was that?
Their success seems linked to their remarkable ability to adapt. They really integrated themselves into the local Indian environment and were open to adopting elements from existing Indian devotional traditions.
And the khanqah was central to their way of life.
Absolutely. The source describes Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia's hospice in Delhi in the 14th century as a real hub. It had living quarters, a big communal hall, Jamat Khana, the sheikh's own space, courtyards, a whole complex. It was even a place of refuge in times of crisis.
And it ran on charity, the langar or open kitchen.
Yes, entirely on future unasked for charity. Donations came in and the kitchen fed everyone, rich or poor, resident or visitor.
The range of visitors sounds incredible. Soldiers, slaves, singers, merchants, poets, Hindu yogis, Qalandars. Why did they all come?
For all sorts of reasons. To become disciples, to seek blessings or amulets, to ask the sheikh to intercede for them, or just to be in his presence. Famous intellectuals like Amir Hassan Sizi, Amir Khusrau, and the historian Ziaud Mirani were regulars and wrote about him.
Figure 6.12 shows Nizamuddin Aulia with Amir Khusrau. How are they depicted?
The painting clearly shows the sheikh in the position of spiritual authority, seated higher, radiating calm. Amir Khusrau is depicted respectfully, perhaps seated lower or gesturing with humility, signifying the master-disciple relationship. It visually represents the reverence accorded to the sheikh within the khanqah environment.
And the Chishtis actively adopted local practices.
They did. Things like bowing before the sheikh, offering water to visitors, shaving initiates' heads, even incorporating yogic exercises into their spiritual routines. It shows a real effort to assimilate and connect with the local culture.
How did the Chishti order spread so widely?
Sheikh Nizamuddin played a key role by appointing successors who went out and established their own hospices in other important centers across India. This network allowed Chishti teachings, practices, and the fame of the main saints to spread rapidly, attracting pilgrims to their shrines. The chart on page 154 shows this expansion clearly.
Two key elements of Chishti devotion were pilgrimage, ziyarat, and music, qawwali. Let's talk about ziyarat.
Pilgrimage to the tombs, dargahs, of Sufi saints is a huge phenomenon across the Muslim world, done to seek the saint's spiritual grace or barakat. And the dargahs of the great Chishti saints in India have drawn people of all backgrounds, different religions, classes for over 7 centuries.
The most famous being Khwaja Mainuddin Chishti's shrine in Ajmer, Karib Nawaz.
Yes, the most revered. Its immense popularity stems from the sheikh's reputation for piety and austerity, the influence of his spiritual successors, its strategic location on a trade route, and, very importantly, royal patronage.
Which sultans and emperors visited Ajmer?
Muhammad bin Tughlaq was the first sultan recorded visiting. Ghiyasuddin Khalji of Malwa funded the earliest tomb structure. Later, Emperor Akbar became a devoted visitor, drawn initially by the singing of pilgrims. He visited 14 times.
Seeking blessings for conquest's heirs.
Exactly. And his visits came with generous gifts. He donated a huge cauldron discs for feeding pilgrims and built a mosque there. Figure 6.33 visually captures this royal connection, showing Jahangir being greeted by sheikhs at Ajmer.
Source 7 gives us that incredibly personal account from Jahanara, Shah Jahan's daughter, about her pilgrimage in 1643. She describes her meticulous preparations, her prayers, her specific actions at the tomb.
Yes, rubbing her face in the dust, walking barefoot, kissing the ground, circling the tomb, applying perfume, placing her scarf.
What do these very specific, intense gestures tell us about how she viewed the dargah?
They scream reverence and humility. She's performing acts of profound submission, setting aside her royal status completely. Kissing the ground, rubbing dust on her face, these aren't everyday actions. They signal that she sees the dargah as an intensely sacred space, imbued with the saint's powerful spiritual presence, barakat. It's a place demanding extraordinary respect, where one connects with the divine through these ritualized acts of devotion and self-abasement.
The other key element was music sama, or qawwali.
Absolutely central to Chishti practice, and a prime example of interaction with Indian traditions. Sama means listening or audition. It involves music, often mystical chants sung by calls, designed to induce a state of spiritual ecstasy.
It's a way of remembering God, alongside reciting the divine names, zikr.
Yes. For the Chishtis, Sama became integral, and the forms it took were deeply influenced by the musical landscape of India.
Source 8 describes the shrine of Nasiruddin Shiragi Delhi. The visitor notes that both Muslims and Hindus come, especially on Sundays and during Diwali, and visit in the same spirit.
That's a remarkable observation, isn't it? It suggests the dargah wasn't just a religious site for Muslims, but a shared cultural and spiritual space. People from different communities came seeking blessings, healing from the spring, or just participating in the atmosphere around the saint's memory, finding common ground there.
The Chishti's connection to local culture extended to language too, didn't it?
Definitely. They didn't just communicate in Persian, the elite language. In Delhi, they famously spoke Hindavi, the local vernacular. Figures like Baba Farid composed poetry in the local Punjabi language, verses later included in the Sikh scripture.
And they wrote long poems, masnavis or pramakyan.
Yes, using allegorical love stories, like Jayasi's Padmavat, to represent the soul's journey towards God. These were often recited during psalm gatherings in the hospices.
Even in the Deccan, Sufis composed poems in local languages like the Khani.
Right. Short poems, sometimes set to the rhythm of women's work songs, lullabies, luranama, wedding songs, Shradanama. This suggests they were drawing inspiration from existing bhakti traditions there, like the Kannada Vachanas or Marathi Amhangs. It was a way for Islamic devotional ideas to find a place within the fabric of village life.
Amir Khusrau, Nizamuddin Aulia's famous disciple, played a key role in shaping qawwali.
He did. He's credited with introducing the qawwal, Arabic for saying, as the opening and closing hymn in Chishti Sama. This would be followed by poetry in Persian, Hindavi, or Urdu. Qawwals at Nizamuddin's shrine still start with the qawwal today, and qawwali itself became this major performance genre across the subcontinent, figure 6.1.
Source 8 also gave us that Charkanama excerpt, the spinning wheel song linking types of zikr to the physical actions of spinning.
Yes, linking audible zikr, silent zikr in the heart, and inner vision to the process of preparing cotton and spinning thread, emphasizing counting breaths and offering the effort to the peer.
How does that compare to Jahanar's description of her ziyarat? What does it show about the different ways devotion was expressed?
It shows the range beautifully. Jahanara's devotion is focused on a specific place, the dargah, involving external rituals of reverence and physical interaction with the sacred site. It's pilgrimage-centered. The Charkanama, however, describes integrating spiritual practice, zikr, into everyday work, making the mundane sacred. It's about internal discipline, finding God in daily activity, guided by the master. One is outward, ritualistic, place-based. The other is inward, integrated into labor, focused on inner states. Both valid paths within Sufism, perhaps reflecting different contexts and needs.
What about the relationship between Sufis, particularly the Chishtis, and the state? They emphasized austerity but weren't totally isolated.
No, it was more nuanced. They did maintain a principled distance from direct political power, but they accepted unsolicited donations and land grants, ininam, from rulers and elites. Sultans set up charitable trusts, okwaf, to support hospices.
But the Chishtis didn't hoard this wealth.
Generally, no. They famously used donations for immediate needs, feeding people in the langar, providing shelter, clothes, facilitating rituals like salma. This practice of distributing wealth rather than accumulating it greatly boosted their moral authority and popularity.
And this popularity made them important to rulers.
Absolutely. Rulers wanted the support, or at least the goodwill, of the masses, and the Sufis commanded huge respect due to their piety, learning, and perceived miraculous powers.
Rulers also sought legitimacy from them, especially if they couldn't strictly impose Sharia.
Yes. Sufis were seen as deriving authority directly from God, independent of the state's legal scholars. Their blessing could legitimize a ruler's reign. Plus, there was the belief that these awliya could intercede with God for material and spiritual benefits, which is why kings often wanted to be buried near Sufi shrines.
Were there tensions?
Sometimes. Issues could arise over expectations of deference, who should bow to whom, and the immense spiritual authority of figures like Nizamuddin Auliya, called Sultan among sheikhs, could potentially rival state power symbolically.
Other Sufi orders had different relationships with the state.
Yes, orders like the Suhrawardis and Naqshbandis were sometimes more closely associated with the court, even accepting official positions, unlike the typical Chishti stance.
Source 9 from the Fawaid al-Fuad gives that great story of Nizamuddin Auliya refusing a ruler's gift of land and gardens.
Right, he says, "What have I to do with gardens and fields?"
Yeah.
And tells the story of Sheikh Farhuddin also refusing land from Sultan Ghiyasuddin, taking only money for the dervishes.
How does he use that story to teach his disciples about the Chishti ideal?
He uses the anecdote, the precedent set by a revered earlier master, to powerfully reinforce the principle of detachment, fashar. It's not just him saying it, it's presented as a core, inherited value of their lineage, demonstrated through the actions of their spiritual ancestors. Storytelling becomes a key method of transmitting these ideals.
And figure 6.15, Sheikh Salim Chishti's tomb at Fatehpur Sikri, Akbar's capital, really symbolizes that close link that did develop between the Chishtis and the Mughal state later on.
It does. Despite the ideal of detachment, complex bonds were clearly forged.
Thinking about these two centers of power, religious and political, what are the potential flashpoints, the sources of conflict?
Well, fundamentally, they draw authority from different sources, temporal power versus divine mandate. Conflicts can erupt over resources, patronage, influence, who commands popular loyalty, legal jurisdiction, state law versus religious law, or when rulers demand endorsements that religious leaders feel unable to give, or when religious leaders critique state actions. It's an inherent tension between spiritual ideals and worldly power dynamics. Okay, let's shift focus again to North India and look at some other new devotional paths that emerged, often in dialogue with the changing social and religious landscape, including the arrival of Islam and Sufism. Three key figures stand out.
First, Kabir, probably lived 14th, 15th century, an incredibly influential figure.
Absolutely. Though pinning down the details of his life is tough for historians, relying mainly on his poems and later hagiographies. His verses were compiled in different traditions, the Kabir Bijak of the Kabir Panth, the Kabir Granthavali in Rajasthan, and significantly, within the Sikh Adi Granth Sahib.
And he wrote in various languages using what's called Sant Bhasha.
Yes, a kind of common spiritual language used by many Nirguna poets.
Oh.
And famously, he used Ulat Bansi, those upside-down sayings.
Like lotus without flower, fire in the ocean. What was the point of those paradoxes?
They seem designed to jolt the listener out of ordinary thinking, to point towards a reality beyond logic and language, the ultimate reality, the divine, which can't be easily described. They hint at mystical experience, forcing you to grapple with meanings beyond the literal.
And Kabir drew on so many different traditions in his poems.
Incredibly eclectic. Source 10, the One Lord, shows him using terms from Islam, Allah, Khuda, Pir, from Vedanta, Alak, Nirakar, Brahman, Atman, and from yogic traditions, Shabda, Shunya.
His ideas can seem diverse, even contradictory sometimes.
They can. Some poems sound very Islamic in their monotheism and rejection of idols, critiquing Hindu practices. Others use Sufi concepts of remembrance, zikr, and love, ishq, to articulate Hindu ideas of remembering God's name, Nam Simran.
In Source 10, his main argument is against seeing different gods.
Yes. He asks how there can be two lords. He lists different names, Allah, Ram, Kareem, Hari, and insists they're all names for the one God. He uses that analogy of gold. You make rings or bangles, but it's still gold. The differences are just names and forms people create.
And he criticizes both Muslims, goat killers, and Hindus, cow killers, for getting caught up in these distinctions and disputes.
He does. He says they're both mistaken, wasting their lives arguing over superficial differences, instead of recognizing the underlying unity of the divine. His core message is, stop fighting over labels. The reality is one.
Even if we aren't sure every poem attributed to him is his, the body of work represents
a powerful legacy of questioning established institutions, both religious and social, in a direct personal search for the divine. His ideas likely developed through his interactions with diverse groups like Sufis and yogis.
And his legacy was claimed by different groups later, leading to debates about whether he was born Hindu or Muslim.
Exactly. Later hagiographies reflect these claims. Vaishnava ones might say he was born Hindu, Kabir does, raised by Muslim weavers, Julahas, maybe initiated by Ramananda, though the timeline for that direct link is problematic. But these stories show how important he became, how different traditions wanted to connect to his authority. And figure 6.16 reminds us, these songs were often kept alive by musicians among the people.
Okay, next. Baba Guru Nanak, 1469-1539.
Born in Punjab, Hindu merchant family, trained as an accountant, knew Persian. He spent time with Sufis and Bhaktas, traveled widely.
And his message was nirguna bhakti, devotion to a formless God.
Strongly so. He rejected the external practices of the religions around him, ritual bathing, sacrifices, idol worship, austerities, exclusive reliance on scriptures like the Vedas or Quran.
For him, God Rab was formless, genderless.
Yes, and the path was simple. Remember and repeat the divine name. He expressed this through hymns, Shabad in Punjabi, often sung with his companion Mardana playing the rabab.
And he organized his followers into a community, the Sangat.
Yes, for collective worship and recitation. He also appointed a successor, Guru Angad, starting the line of Sikh gurus that continued for about 200 years.
Did he intend to start a new religion?
The sources suggest perhaps not initially, but after his death, his followers consolidated their practices, developing a distinct identity. The fifth guru, Guru Arjan, compiled the Adi Granth Sahib, including Nanak's hymns, those of his successors, and other poets like Farid, Ravidas, and Kabir. And the 10th guru, Guru Gobind Singh.
He added the hymns of the 9th guru, finalizing the Guru Granth Sahib as the scripture. He also founded the Khalsa Panth, the Army of the Pure, establishing distinct symbols and consolidating the Sikhs as a socio-religious and military force.
Finally, Mirabai, perhaps the most famous woman Bhakti poet, c. 1516 c.
Her story comes mostly from her Baljans, her songs. A Rajput princess, married into the royal family of Mewar, but devoted herself entirely to Krishna, defying her husband-in-laws.
They supposedly tried to poison her.
So the stories go. She eventually left the palace, became a wandering saint, composing these incredibly intense songs of love for Krishna.
And tradition says her guru was Ridas, a leather worker.
Yes, which again points to her defiance of caste norms. She abandoned palace life for the robes of a renouncer, sometimes white like a widow's, sometimes saffron.
She didn't found a sect, but her songs have inspired people for centuries.
Hugely influential, especially among poorer and lower caste communities in Gujarat and Rajasthan.
Source 11 has that powerful verse. What can Mewar's ruler do to me? What can the Rana do if God is angry? What's that saying about her priorities?
It's pure defiance of earthly power. She's stating unequivocally that only God's displeasure matters. The anger of the Rana, her powerful husband or father-in-law, is insignificant compared to her relationship with Krishna. Her loyalty is to the divine, not the throne.
And the other verse about the funeral pyre. Let flame be lost in flame.
It's just astonishing imagery of complete surrender and longing for union. Using the finality of cremation to express her desire to be totally consumed by, merged with, her divine beloved Krishna, losing her individual self entirely in him. It's incredibly intense devotion.
Why do you think these three, Kabir, Nanak, Mirabai, remain so significant today?
Well, they all represent powerful individual voices challenging the norm, don't they? Questioning religious dogma, rejecting social hierarchies like caste, defying expectations about gender roles. They emphasize a direct personal path to the divine, open to everyone, expressed in accessible language and passionate poetry. Those messages of inclusivity, personal faith, and social critique still resonate very deeply.
So pulling back a bit, how do historians actually go about reconstructing the history of these incredibly diverse and often evolving traditions?
It's clearly a complex task, relying on that whole range of sources we've touched on: sculpture, architecture, the stories about saints, their compositions.
And interpreting material evidence like architecture requires understanding the context, right? The ideas and beliefs of the people who built and used these spaces.
Absolutely. And the textual sources, vachanas, farmans, poetry, they come in so many languages and styles. It demands linguistic skill and real sensitivity to the different genres.
The sources generated within Sufi circles are particularly varied. The source box outlines several types. You have formal treatises or manuals, like Hujwiri's Kashf-ul-Majub.
Then the Malfuzat, the recorded conversations of the saints, like the Fawi al-Fuad, where source 9 came from. These were often meant to teach disciples.
And Maktubat, the letters written by masters. These give insights into the sheikh's thoughts, but also the lives and concerns of the people they were writing to. Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi's letters are mentioned as being particularly studied, sometimes in contrast to Akbar's views.
And finally, Tazkiras, the biographical accounts of saints. Written often to glorify a particular lineage, they might contain legends, but they're vital for understanding how the tradition saw its own history.
So it's this mix of textual and oral communication, some preserved, some changed, some lost.
And the fact that many of these traditions are still alive today is both helpful and challenging for historians.
All right. It allows comparison between past sources and present practices, tracing change. But because these are living faiths, there can be resistance within communities to historical perspectives that emphasize change or diversity over a perceived unchanging continuity.
So the historian needs to be sensitive, respectful, while still applying critical analysis and recognizing that religious traditions, like everything else, evolve over time.
That's the challenge, investigating with rigor and sensitivity.
The sources also briefly mention Shankaradeva in Assam, late 15th century, as another important Vaishnava figure.
Yes, focusing on surrender to Vishnu, emphasizing congregational chanting, Nam Kirtan in Satsanga, and establishing monasteries, Satra, and prayer halls, Namgar. His main work is the Kirtana Ghosha.
It just shows the sheer geographical spread and the regional variations within the broader bhakti phenomenon.
Absolutely. From Tamil Nadu to Karnataka, North India, Punjab, Assam, similar devotional impulses finding unique local expressions.
We've covered such a rich tapestry in this deep dive. The interplay of older structures and new movements, Bhakti and Sufism emerging, the mixing and sometimes clashing of practices, the voices of these incredible poet saints, the intricate relationship with political power, and how historians try to piece it all together.
It's a period just brimming with spiritual exploration, cultural creativity, and human connection.
It really is. We've seen how these traditions weren't static monuments, but living, adapting streams, expressing profound devotion in countless ways, reaching across society.
And thinking about that dynamism, that constant adaptation and dialogue we've seen over centuries, what does that suggest about how these traditions might continue to evolve?
And how do the lived beliefs of people today continue to shape and maybe even subtly rewrite the historical stories we've been discussing? Something to definitely mull over.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.